Hey, so in today's lecture, I'm going to go ahead and introduce you to biology. Let's start with the term biology. What does it mean? Biology is the scientific study of life. So when I say biology is the scientific study of life, what is life? I'm going to go ahead and go over 7 different characteristics or properties of life. The first one we'll talk about will be order, then energy processing. Next, we'll talk about evolutionary adaptation, regulation, growth and development, response to the environment, and lastly, we'll talk about the reproduction. Here we have 7 different characteristics of life. Let's get further into each individual one. Let's first talk about order. So when it comes to order, let's take a look at this beautiful sunflower right here. If we take a close look into the sunflower here in the middle section where we see all like its seeds and stuff, you can see at a cellular level, it's highly organized and structured. Next, we'll talk about energy processing. So if we look at this beautiful butterfly on top of this flower, what the butterfly is doing is taking in that chemical energy or that nectar, right? It's food, it's eating, it's consuming something, and it will turn that chemical energy into energy that can help it fly and do other work, also known as kinetic energy. Let's look at this really cool chameleon right here. So this chameleon has perfected evolutionary adaptation. So basically, over many generations, this species has adapted itself to better survive in their environment. Super cool, right? Let's take a look at this rabbit right here. So this rabbit, first of all, it's super cute. But more importantly, we want to look at these ears. So these big ears on this rabbit. So these ears are there so the rabbit can regulate its internal temperature. Regulation is also known as homeostasis. So homeostasis is a way for us in living organisms to keep a balance. You don't want to get too hot, you don't want to get too cold, you don't want to get too acidic, you don't want to get too basic. Any of those scenarios would lead to death. We do homeostasis all the time. If you get too hot, you're going to start sweating to try to bring down your temperature. If you get too cold, you're going to start shivering to bring up your temperature, right? So regulation is really important. Let's take a look at the next property of life, which is growth and development. So if we look at this plant as it is growing here, we can see living things, they grow, they develop. Just like us, we start out as babies, we turn into toddlers, we go into children, we turn into teenagers, adults. Living things that grow and they develop. A rock is not going to grow and develop. A rock is just going to be there. Now let's take a look at this Venus flytrap here. So when it comes to this Venus flytrap, it's a perfect example of responding to an environment. So this Venus flytrap here is going to respond to an environmental stimulus. The stimulus in this situation so happens to be a fly. So as soon as the fly lands on the Venus flytrap, y'all already know it will close up. It is responding to its environment. We do it all the time too. So for example, if it's hot in the summertime, we're going to try to find shade or water. If you hear bombs or something going off over there, you're probably going to respond by running the other way, right? So living things respond to their environment. Now, if a bomb was to drop right next to a rock, it ain't going to do anything. It's just going to blow up. So let's talk about our last property or characteristic of life, which is reproduction. So when it comes to reproduction, organisms, living things reproduce their own kind. So if we take a look at this cute little mom and baby monkey here, you can see that this mother can go ahead and reproduce its own kind, right? The monkey isn't going to produce a fish, or a fish isn't going to like make a cow or something like that. We reproduce our own kind. There are some exceptions or arguments when it comes to viruses, but that's a whole nother talk for a whole nother day. Now that you're confident with 7 different properties of life, let's talk about the hierarchy of life. So when it comes to the hierarchy of life, what this means, it's basically the level of biological organization. So how we organize things from the smallest thing, like an atom, all the way up to the biggest thing, which is the biosphere or the earth. Let's get into it. The first level that we'll talk about today will be atoms. Next, we'll get into molecules. We'll then talk about organelles, talk about cells. We'll talk about tissues, organs, and organ systems. We'll talk about an actual organism, population, community, ecosystem, and the biosphere. Let's get into it. So let's take a look here at an atom. So this atom consists of subatomic particles, protons, neutrons, and electrons. We'll get into greater detail as the lectures go on. But for now, just know that atoms are the smallest unit that you can have, right? They're the smallest unit. For example, an atom can be a hydrogen, an oxygen. Any of those elements that you'll find on the periodic table will be an atom or an element. Now, when we start connecting those atoms and elements together, we have an oxygen atom as well as 2 hydrogen atoms. This is going to make a molecule of water. So when you have 2 or more atoms linked together, we now have a molecule. When you are linking molecules together, you can get what's called organelles. So here you can see I have 2 types of organelles. These are going to be our energy processing organelles. So for an animal cell or a eukaryotic cell, we can have the mitochondria. So the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. If we're talking about a eukaryotic cell or a plant cell that has chloroplasts in it, the chloroplasts are also there for photosynthesis. So it's an energy organelle. When we have many organelles together, and we have a whole bunch of them inside of a cell, right? So when it comes to the cell, this is where we have life. And I'll go ahead and write that here just as a little note. So we have life. So when we get many cells linked together, we now get what's called a tissue. So we have many different types of tissues in our body. When we have many tissues coming together, we then get what's called an organ. That cardiac muscle tissue together, we now have the heart, which is an organ. When we have several organs coming together, we get what's called an organ system, which is this guy right here with all the arteries and veins and the heart, the circulatory system going on here. Next, when we have the organs and the organ systems working together, we have an actual organism. So right here we have a person, right? So an actual living organism, right? So with all of its systems and tissues and cells working together, we have an organism. We have a person, a human, a lion, a monkey, an organism. Now, when we have many of the same organism in a designated area, that's what we would call a population. So here we have this population of this specific species of monkey. So then when we have the population, which we know is all of the species within the bounds of a specific area, when we include the tree species, the plant species, the different types of grasses, bacteria, fungi, things like that that can be found in the environment, we now have what's called the community. So you might hear when, I don't know, they're making an announcement about taking care of your community. The community is not just the people that live there, but it's also making sure you're keeping up with your trees and your bushes. The community is going to not not only just be the monkeys, but it's also going to include the other species that are around the monkeys, like the trees and the plants and the grass, and of course that lovely bacteria, which is everywhere. So when we are looking at all the living things that are in this community, when we include the living things as well as non-living things, like rocks, sand, like if you're in a desert environment, water, when we're including living and non-living things, we now have what's known as an ecosystem. So the ecosystem includes living and non-living things. So here in this picture, you can see some living plants in here, but we can also see the non-living rocks as well. So ecosystem is going to include living and non-living things. Last, we'll talk about Earth, which is also known as the biosphere. So everything that we just talked about and went through is all within the bounds of our biosphere. Earth includes the ecosystem, communities, populations, it includes the organisms, it includes it all, right? So life is only found here on Earth. I'll catch you in the next lecture. Happy studying.